we've got John Vines with Squirrel talking about visibility labels. We particularly chose this talk to be first just because visibility labels is one of the really cool things about Accumulo. So we're really excited to have this talk. John Vines is a long-term committer. He's been working on Accumulo for a very long time. He recently left the area to go up to Boston with Squirrel. Fortunately, unfortunately, I'm not sure. Just kidding. So enjoy the talk. Thanks.
Hi, I'm John. I'm going to use this mic because I want to walk around because it's really cramped over here. So my talk, Accumulo Visibility Labels and Pluggable Authorization Systems, a love story. If you don't know why they're a love story, you'll find out by the end, and if I haven't answered your question, if I haven't explained why, feel free to ask. So, like Don said, no, he chose this talk first because I'm going to be talking about visibility labels. So, first, of course, to preface, what makes Accumulo special when it comes to security? You're here for a reason. You're already familiar to some extent with Accumulo. But if you don't know, Accumulo has these things called visibility labels, and they kind of make things extra special in Accumulo because they provide the ability to push any sort of data filtering to these systems so it doesn't have to be managed at a higher level in your application. So to keep it short, as part of the Accumulo key, since it's a key value store, the fourth item, visibilities, is a label. In Accumulo, a label is simply a set of labels with ands and ors and parentheses to denote a Boolean expression. You satisfy the equation, you get the key value pair. Don't satisfy the equation, you have no idea it even exists. Short of it, visibilities are like ACLs, except they're a list of labels, not users, unless you're doing things horrendously wrong. I'll explain to you why it's horrendously wrong as we work through this. So, what does using visibility labels get me? Because you can filter your data internally to database, it makes things simpler for the application developer, and it allows you to merge your different data sets together that may have completely different handling restrictions. Maybe it's because of healthcare information, maybe it's because of DoD restrictions, maybe it's because of an NDA you have. Whatever the reason, this gives you the ability to merge things together that otherwise should not be mergeable. So I'm going to walk through a few scenarios as a first-time Accumulo user who's trying to figure out how do I properly use visibility labels and how do I properly use a system in a secure manner from a labeling standpoint. So I don't know what I'm doing. So first things first, I get Accumulo up and running. We'll pretend like that was a really non-painful experience. And I'm just going to start shoving my data in there. Maybe I upload my entire home directory off my system, and I just put things in there. And I decide, what, it's my data. I just want to tag it with something to denote that it's mine and to keep others from seeing it. So I put everything with John's label. I'm John if you didn't remember that. So I do a scan without my label. I see nothing. Sad trombone, not really, because that's the intent of it. It's like no data's even there. And if I do a scan with it, hey, look, I see all of my data. The problem here is if I actually develop an application for it, and I start sharing it with my friends and coworkers and random strangers on the internet, suddenly they see all of my data, not just the stuff for the application. So I'm just going to go ahead and relabel everything. I'm going to go ahead and relabel everything that is used for my application, John's application. That way, my data I want to keep private is still private, but the data I want to use for the application is tagged appropriately. And that works well, except, what does my label even mean? As I go ahead and create more and more applications using maybe some of them overlap the same data, maybe some of them use different pieces of data, everything tagged with John's application doesn't really have any meaning anymore. It's just a filter to keep my personal data from the stuff used for applications. So I'm just going to go ahead and start labeling everything according to the application it's used for. So maybe I have one application that uses some pieces of that data, maybe I have different applications that use other, and some of them even overlap with an OR. And this sounds great. Chug along, I keep ingesting more data, I keep tagging things appropriately for the application they're used for. But we come into a scaling problem when we start developing more and more applications. Not only do we have to tag things more and more, but we have to go ahead and actually relabel all of our existing data. That does not scale. That's not big data. That's not fun. So we need to go back to the drawing board. And you got to ask yourself, what am I trying to accomplish? What am I trying to do with my data? Why am I segregating it? So, I mean, why are you segregating? Different applications. Why are different applications have different access to data? Because different organizations are using it. So I'm going to tag it according to the organization using it instead. And so this seems all well and good, but you know, especially with some of the entities who are here today, organizations are big, and there are a lot of people involved. So you know what? Instead of doing like high-level, top-level organizations, we'll get into sub-organizations. However, reorgs happen. So, and that goes back to the problem of having to relabel all of your data again. So now we're going to ask ourselves, we got a step closer to the problem. We went from tagging things to the application down to the people using it, but we need to go a step lower. We need to go down to why are these different organizations using these different applications? Why are they restricted to that data? So we're going to drill down a step further and start labeling things according to what the data actually is. That's one of the core tenets that needs to be kept in mind when tagging data. Tag according to what it is, not who's using it. Otherwise, you end up with scaling problems or when things change. Basically, when things change around, things inevitably change. So you want to try to give yourself as much control and granularity in tagging things as possible to accommodate that. So we have a good-looking labeling system, but you know, we're talking about giant organizations now using the system that just a few slides ago I was just starting to use. So that's great traction, great ground speed on getting it picked up. But you know what? Managing users through the little Accumulo shell and creating every single one and defining their roles on an individual basis, again, not scalable. Having to create an account for every single person in a 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 or plus organization and individually manage each and every single one of their visibility labels as they are constantly changing meanings, having certain provisions about whether or not they actually have them, just doesn't work. So this is where pluggable security comes into play. So Accumulo provides you the ability to provide a pluggable authorizer. Authorizer being the thing that denotes what authorizations you have. So this is code, and this is how you set it up, but what does that even mean? So basically, in the pipeline, as you do a scan, a query against Accumulo, first your query comes in, and the set of labels that the user says, I have these labels, gets checked. By default, these labels are kept in Zookeeper, and they get checked, and as long as the ones that you're requesting to use are a subset of the ones you actually have, everything's fine. But like I said, keeping everything in Zookeeper is bad, but we have a pluggable authorizer on the critical path for it, which means that you can go out to an external service and ask them, hey, what authorizations does this user have? So now we can use an existing system. In my case, I'm going to say LDAP. Or maybe you have something else, Active Directory is basically LDAP, or anything your heart desires, because you know what? It's a pluggable API. As long as there's an API for whatever system you're trying to hit, you're fine. So we have LDAP Setup. Users have individual labels to denote what role they're filling in their organization. So now you have one less system you have to maintain. That is a giant monkey off the back for the sysadmins at the very least. But it goes a step further. So there is one issue here. We have hierarchical organizations. If you're in, I2424, you're also in I242, you're also in I24, you're also in I2, you're also in I. So maybe your system doesn't actually provide that. I'm not, maybe that makes sense for your external system, maybe it doesn't. But let's say we have to bear this burden. That's fine. Again, we have a pluggable authorizer. So we'll just have it also do the hierarchical mapping for you. If you're in one organization and have one role, you have these other ones as well. This is kind of the nature of your data. And so doing this means that you can easily expand out to scale out your data. But we're going to go back to our previous example where we have everything mapped out, our users are happy, but maybe we actually want to exclude certain people from seeing our data. Maybe it's for medical reasons. Maybe you're doing a clinical trial where you have to divide out the data to different people for a blind study. Or maybe there's this certain situations where someone with role A cannot see data B. So that was a goof in my slides, and so we do this. And you say either, hey, that looks great, or John, what are you doing? Accumulo doesn't support knots. Knots are bad. You can easily, with knots, completely sabotage your entire labeling structure by adding in knots because it breaks the fundamental tendency of the system, which is it is a white list, not a black list. So when you do this, and you say, I want knots, you shouldn't be asking, why can't I have knots? I'm going to ask, and if you do say that, I'm going to come back to you saying, what are you trying to accomplish? Why are you restricting that? And maybe you say, well, maybe I don't want the managers to see this data because I only want the workers and contractors to see the data. Or maybe you actually have a literal label, not manager, and your pluggable authorization system can enforce that properly. So, OK, I think we have a pretty good workaround for not managers. But maybe, in addition to this, we also have some other piece. Maybe we want a different view for the same piece of data, the same key value pair. Key value pair in air quotes, because you know what? This is something that we want to do. If you remember, the visibility label is part of the key, which makes it part of the uniqueness of the key, which means you can do things like this and have completely identical, for the most part, keys that different people see depending on their characteristics. Now you can kind of give segregated views of the same piece of data such that you have more control over who sees what and how. OK, cool. We're making some progress here. But if you remember before, I said, if a user doesn't satisfy the labels, they don't see the data at all. Well, I don't like that. I want them to know that there's something there that there's not allowed to see it. Maybe there's a very core tenet of sharing that you still want to keep around. Well, again, visibility labels are part of the key. We'll just put in a key without a label. So that way people who don't have anything can see that there's something there, but they don't necessarily get the value out of it. Or a different value that says, hey, there's something here, and you can't see it because of this reason. Or maybe you actually put in a list of labels so that way they know who to ask about who can actually see that data. You have a lot of options here. And so now we're starting to go down the route of how we deal with data management. We're doing this because we want to share existence of data. And who cares more about the existence of data than a root user? Maybe you have a root user who needs to be able to see everything to properly debug things. Maybe an application is wrong and it needs full access. That's a bad idea. I want root access to my data. I want to see everything. OK. I don't advise this, but because it's the core tenet of the system. Only people who have the appropriate labels see the data. If you give someone root access, eventually someone's going to find a way to abuse root. But we'll go with it. And you just tag all your data with root or the existing expression. And that's really ugly. You know what? And like I said before, it kind of goes down the route of data management and how much of a pain in the butt it is. Because you just have this single point of failure written into every single piece of your data that's going to leak things, potentially. Hopefully not, but inevitably it probably will. But remember, we have a pluggable authorizer. So we can just say in there that there's a root user. LDAP knows about all the roles it's going to give out to all the existing users. So you can just give it a special space where certain root users can get full access to everything. So this does kind of throw some hiccups in things because this means you have a single user who can potentially gain access to everything, which means you need to make sure that your system you're referring to for your authorizations has good security in place, and you don't have people messing with the pluggable code that you're actually running. And unfortunately, that just boils down to good system management practices. So to recap, we have everything labeled. We have a pluggable system going out to an external system so I don't have to manage everything. We have the ability to fine-grain who sees what and how they see it. And so for the most part, all of our bases are covered. Except, what if we want to do something fancier? What if we want to get really crafty? Maybe we want to actually provide more restrictions. Maybe don't allow access to certain pieces of data if a user's VPN'd in. Maybe we don't allow them if they're logged in from a terminal that's within certain state or country boundaries. Maybe there's something that just came up on the fly and you suddenly need to massively share more data or restrict more data, or restrict less data. There. Maybe you had some sort of problems with your ignition switches in your cars and you suddenly don't want everyone in the company to see it. So you have a pluggable authorizer. I keep saying that, but you have a pluggable authorizer, which gives you a lot of control if you're willing to take up a little bit of the penalty in developing it. And so if you have the data available, you can use it. If you have a system that tracks where users are logged in from, what time of day it is. Time of day is actually fairly easy. You don't even need an external system to reach out to you. You just need something grabbing dates in the pluggable authorizer. But you can reach out to multiple systems to get the different. It's going to slow down your performance, yes, but it's a minor overhead for the amount of security you need, or you think you need anyway. So if the data is available, you can use it. But the one caveat I really want to, remind you of as we go forward is that visibility labels are literally filters. They just check the label as the data is percolating off a disk. If it's not satisfied, it just drops on the floor and it carries on. So if you're doing a giant scan that's touching every single piece of data in a table or multiple tables, and you have no visibility labels that can satisfy any of the data in there, you will get no results back, and it's going to kind of sit there for a while as it just reads everything off a disk. Unfortunately, it's just not that performant. But it's not really made to be. It's made to give fine-grained access. This sounds like a job for coarse access controls. Well, we have a system for that. So in addition to visibility labels for data filtering, we also have just coarse ACLs, permissions. They are at the system level. They're at the table level. And so if you have a certain table that, a user is missing these labels, they literally cannot read anything off that table, let's just not give them access. And we can do that. So not only does pluggable security provide you a framework for authorizations, but also permissions. And it's actually very similar. And so with it, just like how at scan time, visibilities are retrieved from the pluggable system, potentially through an external service, we can do the same things with permissions. And so you can basically say, if user doesn't have these authorizations, we're not even going to bother giving you read access to that table because, I'm going to say you're saving the user effort by giving them a very fast fail. And you can do the same thing with writes and system-level permissions like creating new tables or dropping things. But for the most part, those are typically restricted to root users, and you're probably going to want those managed separately. But you can just as easily have them refer back to an external service, so you have a single point of user management you don't really have to deal with. So now we can use our existing system for coarse access. And with doing this, we really have something really put together. User comes in, permissions get checked. They have some permissions that work, they'll get read access. Otherwise, nope, table access denied. And maybe you have an application on top of that that says, oh, table access denied, they don't, no data available. Or maybe you want to give that information like that they cannot read the table, and maybe there's documentation so that if they get this, then they are denied permission. That's really up to the user because that's exposed all through our client API. So to recap this, just to drill everything home. First and foremost, label for the data at the finest granularity you can, simply because it gives you more flexibility down the road. You can just as easily look at your data and think, I'm going to be accessing this way, and this is how it's going to be used, but I think we all know that there's no perpetuity in this. You'll use it, and then eventually a new restriction comes from on high, or a request, or a new data type comes in, and eventually you say, what? I need to suddenly remanage this. And unfortunately, once your data is labeled, the only way to relabel it is to re-ingest it, which can be a very time-consuming process depending on how much data you have. Again, I say, not scalable. So avoid paying penalties down the road as best you can by labeling at the finest granularity you can, because the system can handle that. And then you can just let the pluggable security do the extra lifting you have to do. It can reach out to external systems. It can do weird combinatorics. Between the combinatorics you can do in the authorizer and the combinatorics you can do in the label expression, you really have a lot of control over how people actually deal with data. And this also gives you the ability to actually, deal with special restrictions you may have. And then, of course, not having to deal with management penalty is going to, pay itself off well. But fundamentally, we threw out cell-level security, and even though someone broke the bingo game earlier already with a little word cloud type thing, I'm going to say it again. Cell-level security, big buzzword, but it actually has meaning because it really gives you the fine ability to restrict data and control how users share amalgamated data spaces. And so between the combination of the visibility labels, the data labels, and the ability for the authorizer to control granted labels and how people access them, you have two components that individually don't form a whole security story. But when you take the two of them, they are cell-level security. And if you put the two together, magic happens. And this is our love story for why the two of them together coalesce to form a full security picture that manages all of our to deal with covering classic security stories. You don't necessarily have the ability to restrict all of your data solely at the label because you can't label by the person. You do abstract labels, fine-grained labels that actually have meaning, authorization together. You get a full story that allows you to have full control for all of your data in a fairly dynamic way, even though the labels themselves should be considered static once written. So that was a little faster than I thought, but I'm going to leave a lot of time for questions. Sorry. The question was for web application type systems where you have a single user coming in managing things, how can this be utilized? So first initial reaction is maybe you don't want a single user touching everything. You want a user-generated, pass through the web application. That would be my first suggestion for that. However, if you really want to do that, you have other options. Accumulo's passive tokens are actually an extensible type. So one option is to kind of wrap the one being passed in under a special token for that user coming in. So you have a web application user who has some level of access, but then you also have this token that can be used by the pluggable systems so you get authenticated one way, but authorized a different way, and that can use a lot of flexibility. It works. It's kind of crafty and fun, but not better than actually trying to keep users as raw as possible. Yes. So the thing about Accumulo connector objects is they're nothing more than a fancy wrapper for a user's authentication tokens and the instance object. The instance object itself is what stores a lot of the cache data about, the cache metadata locations. Actually, that's really the brunt of the data that gets cached, as well as some of the zookeeper information. So having multiple connector objects is not a penalty you should really be worrying about. They can all use the same instance object, which just carries the burden of Accumulo clients, but you don't have to worry about multiple users using the same instance. So you can lay out all of your data in such a way that, if you lay your data, this kind of falls where it lies based on the sorted nature of Accumulo. But if you really care about only the data that's available to a certain user, and you're constantly querying the entire data space, there might be an optimization there in your table layout. Perhaps, if in this case, maybe it sounds like you either have a provider who wants all their information, or a doctor who wants all their information from a provider. Is that close to what you're getting at? So one option there is to keep track of, who you're. So there's no real true efficient solution through just these mechanisms. You'll need another one, even if it's just an external mapping, to keep you aware of who your users are and then query individual users, And that way, if a person who's not, isn't their physician queries, they can still restrict everything down. So if they're trying to query for a user that they're not actually servicing, they get nothing back. But that way, you still kind of use the user as the primary, as the the row label or part of the primary key, so that way they can be quickly found. Because you don't want to fall back on the visibility filters as a resource for managing full table scans, unless you really have no recourse, and I don't see those in most cases. Right. So you use that to basically dynamically provide a list of what patients can I actually look at, and that uses the security aspect, but there's a table design aspect on that as well. To make it more, to actually make it really performant. So I mean, if you already have an accessible system that says Dr. A has these patients, you can use that system externally as well to say, if I orient all of my patients as as rows, I will only be grabbing the rows for the users that are my patients. I mean, so fundamentally, Accumulo keys are nothing but just blobs and bytes. So you can just as well do that, maybe having numeric identifiers for your patients. I mean, that's going to be more scalable than actual names because of, you're going to have collisions. So you can just as well use any sort of byte array to identify users, as long as you have a mapping for what denotation for my patients from a doctor, you can efficiently do that. I mean, in this case, the user is the application. So that does sound correct to me because every user literally has their own data, and that is the unit of granularity. If there's another reason why the users only have access, have full access to their data, it should be used. But it's nothing more than this is my data, I own it, I should be able to. I'm the only one who sees it because it is my data. Then that is the finest unit of granularity you have. The second kind of fits more of a common space where it gets shared to a bunch of users. Maybe there's a space for either tagging things with, John's data and John's shared data, and that way I say, who am I sharing my data with, and they can also see it. But to do that at finer granularity, you could start experimenting with group labels. If their data is actually subsetted, you can at the just time tag it with the appropriate subsets as well, so you can have restricted shared for partial sets of the user's data. It sounds like you're saying that you're using a generated ID for every user that you're using as the row ID. Yeah, I mean, you can just as easily use the same row ID as a visibility label as long as there's a mechanism in place. As long as you know what those labels are and have the ability to give them to a user or users that need it. That sounds totally acceptable. Yes, and so that basically that'll break down into kind of a back scan where you're grabbing a whole bunch of rows with the same visibility labels. But the reason you still want to use the pluggable security in this case is because if Joe user comes along and queries for those users, they don't actually see anything because even though they found the row ID for it, they don't have privileges for it. Yeah, I mean, in this case, it's about the patient, and so who has that is so the problem is in this case you got to be careful with is you are managing both a user's data and the doctors and higher level people who should have access to it or portions of it, because there are finer grained restrictions with medical data you can deal with. And so using the label as first person, let's be realistic, the patient themselves are most likely not going to use the database, but you can make that available. But you also want to include a component that can, if you just were able to scan the table raw, with defined amount of labels, you can probably do something that shows everything, but with political security, you can develop something that dynamically considers who the user is and their role, such that if I'm the patient, I can see my data and only my data and all of my data versus things that are tagged or can only be seen by a cardiologist or an oncologist are tagged appropriate, are still tagged such that only they can see those components because dynamically says this is the oncologist for John Doe and it's tagged John Doe and oncologist, but it's just so happen you can have a system that's set up for with a given patient, John Doe, I agree with the system, it gives me full, either there's like patient or role. And so you use a combination of John Doe and patient or oncologist, and you can use a series of those cascading labels to dynamically deal with that. So that is another option. You can actually give everything kind of a kind of unique ID that maps to having these special considerations. That is feasible. I mean, there have been tests on Accumulo where if you give every single piece a different visibility label, you only incur about a 10% performance penalty, so it's not that bad. But then you have to solely rely on an external system to figure out what this arbitrary label means. And so, way back in the day, 2009, 10, the decision was made to go from using just weird compacted byte arrays to using strings with ands and ors, which makes it a whole lot easier to use and a whole lot more readable. And that's actually a really nice benefit that some people who are working closely against the system can actually benefit from. Just being able to touch the data closely and understand it innately without having to do it with a lot of external systems. So if you can tag things in a semi-readable fashion, but still rely on an external system, you're not actually breaking that concept of having the data that's, you're not losing the ability to look at a key and still realize what it means. No, so included is the very basic the basic implementation, which has been more or less the same implementation since 2010. It's one through Zookeeper, where if you go to the shell, you can create a user, give them a password, give them permissions, set authorizations if you have certain other apples involved. And so there is a built-in management. The only real issue with that is, and it's also accessible through the Java API, the only real issue with that is it's not that scalable because it's all internal. And so, the big message, if you're dealing with a large user base, you don't want to have to individually manage them on every single system you have. And just being able to rely on an external system is a nice perk you can get. But you don't need it to first get started and kind of learn your way through it. Okay, so you do not have control over what the query actually is by the time you get to the authorizer. What the interface gives you, the only real thing you're missing on here is an optional, get auths, which spits out a list interface. But we actually found this not scalable on either, I think 150 or 151, and 160 that got changed to be has auths. And so the interface that you will implement in Java for this is simply it's a Boolean method that takes in a set or a list of strings, which are the authorizations. And so that way the user can decide, the pluggable authorization developer can decide what is or is not satisfied. So, in the case I was going over, in there would be a query against with some cache LDAP information, and basically, if it's not, the set being passed is not a subset of what they have, I get rejected. But you can do fancier things if you really want to, including, dealing with external policy and things as well. Answer your question? Yeah, and that's what I'm saying before. You can ask the external system to figure out, you can use the exact same system that are being used for labels, but you still have the security of the labels intact as well. The client hitting Accumulo would get 2 separate key value pairs, and then it's up to the application above it to how do I handle this? Maybe I combine. Another alternative is you could actually have a iterator in that ignores kind of flattens visibilities and things like that. Okay. If anyone has any other questions, flag me down, and I'll talk about that.